Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to take your source material, the articles, research, earnings calls, whatever you've got, and really sift through it. Find those key insights, the surprising bits, and basically help you get informed fast. Today, we are doing a deep dive into an earnings call transcript. It's for RAP's first quarter of 2025. Our mission here is to really get a handle on what management was saying, where the company stands, what direction they're headed, and what they're really focusing on right now.
Exactly. Earnings calls, they can be pretty dense, right? Lots of numbers, corporate jargon. So we'll look at the key financials they reported. We'll unpack the big strategic messages from the CEO and the president and see what we can learn from the Q&A too. It's all about trying to cut through that noise, get to the core story management wants you to hear.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Looking at the numbers for Q1 2025, what's the sort of immediate financial picture that jumps out?
Well, okay, let's start with cash. That saw a pretty significant bump, actually. They reported $6.2 million in cash for Q1 2025. And that's up quite a bit from $3.6 million in the same quarter last year.
Okay, so more cash on hand, that's generally good. What about profitability? Margins are usually a big focus.
And margins, yeah, that's where you saw a really dramatic change. They reported a jump of, get this, over 21 points. They went from 56.6% in Q1 2024 all the way up to 77.8% in Q1 2025. That's a huge swing.
Wow, yeah, over 77%. That's substantial. What drove that kind of increase?
According to the call, it was mostly because their cost of revenues dropped significantly. I mean, they saw that figure fall by a massive 73.4%. It went from about $640,000 down to just $170,000 year over year for the quarter. So basically, it spent a lot less to generate their revenue this time around.
Right, so costs plummeted, which massively boosted those margins. How did that then translate to the bottom line results they shared?
Well, the operating loss actually improved. It narrowed by about 5.2%. Moved from negative $4.1 million in Q1 last year to negative $3.9 million in Q1 this year. They also reported revenue for Q1 2025 at $765,000. But interestingly, net income for the quarter was $109,000. And that was actually slightly down from $117,000 in Q1 2024.
Okay, that is interesting. So better cash, much better margins because costs are way down, a smaller operating loss.
Yeah.
But net income dipped slightly year over year. That kind of tells a story about maybe efficiency gains versus pure top line growth in the quarter. And it feels like understanding how they plan to use this position, for future growth. That was his main theme. And this is where it gets really interesting, I think, because management spent a lot of time talking about their main product, the BolaWrap, and this new data they finally got.
Absolutely. The CEO really kicked things off by placing their business right in the middle of that whole national conversation around police use of force. They shared some, pretty stark numbers. Apparently 20,000 arrests happen every day in the U.S. Of those, about 20% involve resistance, so that's 4,000 people a day. And the critical point they made, 90% of that resistance becomes hands-on, often when someone's unarmed or maybe having a mental health crisis.
And they suggested this shift towards more hands-on stuff is because of policy changes over the last decade, making officers maybe hesitant with traditional tools.
Right. Things like guns, batons, pepper spray, tasers. The idea being policies have made officers more reluctant in some situations, and management's key point was the consequence of that. They stated that when officers do go hands-on, half the time, 50%, they get hurt. And that leads to huge ongoing costs for cities and departments, officer injuries, workers' comp lawsuits, potentially billions every year. So they position their product, the BolaWrap, as the direct answer to that specific, very expensive problem.
That framing definitely connects the dots, links the product to a big cost and safety issue.
Okay.
And this data they kept talking about, it sounds like it was a real effort, took years.
Yeah, they really emphasized that. They mentioned tracking over a dozen police departments now where officers are apparently using the BolaWrap really frequently, like 2 to 3 times, even up to 5 times more often than anything else on their belt. And they stressed this was happening even without strong company support in those early days, which is interesting.
High usage without much support. Why was it so hard to get this data in the first place, according to them?
Well, they admitted it's, a sensitive topic. Use of force incidents, they're often part of active investigations, they're evidence. They even said some departments didn't historically count BolaWrap use as a reportable use of force, which obviously makes tracking it consistently pretty tricky.
Okay, so difficult to track sensitive stuff. But the management takeaway now is they have the data, and it's clear. Is that the message?
That was definitely the vibe. They feel the data's in and it shows programs work well, officers use the product a lot when the company is engaged with the department. Their plan now is to really lean into this data. They believe it proves the BolaWrap makes officers safer and should become standard gear.
Right. And the CEO sounded quite confident, calling it the only hands-on tool in the marketplace with more usage than any other tool on the belt with connected customers. That's a pretty bold claim.
It is, presumably based on this data they've gathered. And building right off that data point, they talked about how they plan to use it to drive sales and, get the word out more effectively.
They mentioned selling, over $30 million worth before without this kind of hard data.
Yeah.
So how does having it change their sales game now?
They said it's already changing conversations, specifically mentioned major cities that had previously canned their programs, as they put it. Seeing this new data, these cities are apparently now thinking about restarting those BolaWrap programs.
Wow, okay, bringing back potentially major customers who left. That would be significant. How are they planning to package this data to make it convincing?
The strategy they laid out is basically to present it so it's just obvious that the BolaWrap lowers those costs we talked about. Workers' comp, officer injuries, subject injuries, lawsuits, all those use of force related expenses. They think that clear dollars and cents data story will really hit home with everyone involved.
And this is where their target audience for sales seems to be broadening out quite a bit, right?
Yeah.
They talked about going after political leaders, not just police chiefs.
That's a really key shift they highlighted. The president specifically mentioned being in D.C., engaging at the federal and political level. The thinking is the BolaWrap fits into that bigger national use of force conversation, things like consent decrees. So the decision isn't just up to the police department. There are political layers involved.
So it's less about just buying gear and more about it being part of a wider policy discussion.
Yeah, exactly. They stressed it needs this sort of coordinated push involving political moves. They also mentioned leveraging contacts from their W1 partnership. We can touch on that more later for their industry and government connections to help with this.
And they think the data works especially well for that political audience.
Yeah, they said it explicitly. The data is an even bigger sell to the politicians because it lets them quantify the benefits in a way they maybe couldn't before. They see that ability to show the numbers to political leaders as a real unlock moment for getting broader adoption.
Okay, so that's the sales strategy shift driven by data. Moving over to operations. What did they say about the manufacturing side?
Yeah, they gave an update there. The move to Virginia, that's done. And they stated all the restructuring costs tied to that move are finalized, booked.
Good to hear that's wrapped up. Costs are known. What about the facility itself? Are they up and running properly?
Well, the current place in Virginia is temporary. They mentioned a new permanent building is being worked on. It's being coordinated through the governor's office and economic development folks there, expected to be ready by the end of this year. But importantly, in the meantime, they said they have strong inventory levels, plenty of the BolaWrap 150s and the cassettes, plus raw materials to meet demand from their existing stock.
Got it. So operations are stable for now with inventory and a permanent fix is coming.
Okay, shifting gears again. International sounded like a big opportunity on the call. Did they give updates on specific places like Chile or Italy?
They did. Italy, actually, no specific update on this call, but Chile, yeah, they went into quite a bit of detail, said it's been a multi-year process, starting small.
How's that developed?
Well, deployments grew from just 500 devices initially to 2,000 with the Carabinero, Chile's national police force. And based on hundreds of uses there, the Carabinero have now apparently decided to standardize on the equipment.
Standardize?
Yeah.
That implies a much bigger rollout, doesn't it? Oh, yeah, absolutely. Management said Chile has made this public, even put a specific budget line item in for it. They expect it to be a this-year event, meaning the formal decision, but the rollout itself will be multi-year. And they hinted the potential size could be much bigger than maybe they first thought, possibly full deployment across all 33,000 officers in the Carabinero.
Whoa, 33,000 devices.
Yeah.
That's a huge number. Makes Chile sound like a really key case study for them.
It definitely does. And they explicitly framed it as a model they think they can replicate in other countries. And to help with these big international deals, they highlighted bringing on a former chief banking officer from the U.S. Export and Import Bank Exium as an advisor. Because the BolaWrap is assembled here in the U.S., it qualifies for Exim financing options.
Ah, so Exium, the U.S. export agency, could help foreign governments finance these large purchases, making it easier for them to buy.
Exactly. It's a potential financial tool to smooth the path for big international government deals. They also mentioned getting invites to embassies in D.C. now. Ambassadors are asking about their program, often bringing up Chile.
So that international buzz seems to be growing. How are they capitalizing on that?
They definitely think global interest is heating up. They see chances for more repeatable, scalable sales processes internationally. That includes working better with distributors and really using those relationships through embassies, which they said is partly helped by the W1 acquisitions network.
Right. Speaking of overcoming hurdles, the call also touched on past problems, didn't it? Specifically that LAPD test pilot a few years back.
Yes, they did. They acknowledged that pilot did not go well, was how they put it. They listed a few possible reasons why that happened and why maybe some other major cities didn't move forward after pilot either. Things like politics, officer turnover, training problems, even company leadership back then.
Okay, so they're owning those past setbacks. The big question then is, how do they overcome that history now? Change minds in those cities.
It all comes back to the data. Again, that's their strategy. Management believes that sharing these new results, showing the BolaWrap is working really, really well, getting high usage in these connected departments, that fundamentally changes the conversation compared to a few years ago.
And are they actively planning to go back to places like LA?
They sounded confident they will be back in front of LA and those other major cities that paused. They basically said it would be a very hard time believing they're just not going to move forward with us because the data is speaking for itself. A pretty strong statement of faith in that data.
Yeah, data is clearly the cornerstone now. Okay, finally, they talked about that W1 acquisition. Addressed a question about whether they're trying to build something like Kroll Associates, with all the experienced former officials.
Right, and they gave kind of a yes and no answer, which was interesting. The yes part is about the people they've brought in. Former top folks from the FBI, DEA, intelligence, the Pentagon, people with huge global networks and credibility. They see that as similar to how a firm like Kroll uses that kind of deep experience to open doors globally, build relationships.
Okay, so the kind of people is similar. What's the no part then?
The crucial difference, they stressed, is the goal for the revenue model. While these W1 experts could just do consulting, which they noted can be kind of inconsistent or bumpy revenue, their main goal is building a scalable, technology tech-enabled business.
So it's not just about selling advisory services on the side.
Correct. The plan is for these high-level individuals to primarily support the core BolaWrap program. They're framing it as part of a managed service that's tech-enabled and a recurring business line. Okay. So these experts add credibility, prestige, open doors, and bolster the main BolaWrap offering, helping expand recurring revenue tied to the tech, rather than just being consultants for hire.
And how does W1 connect back to those other points, like international sales or the political angle?
Management tied it together nicely. They said W1's network gives them deep reach into places like the State Department, embassies worldwide. They see this helping them get information into target countries, maybe get U.S. backing or support for what they're doing, which in turn they think will speed up landing those large overseas deals and just generally strengthen support for their distributors on the ground.
Okay, so pulling all of this together for you, the listener, it really feels like this earnings call paints a picture of a company that believes it's hit a turning point. They're clearly pivoting their go-to-market strategy, and it's all centered around this newly validated usage data for their BolaWrap product.
Yeah, they laid out a pretty clear multi-part strategy, use the data to win over departments and politicians, develop more scalable sales methods, both here and abroad, especially using that Chile example and egg-sum financing, integrate W1 for global reach and that expert credibility, and face those past failures head-on with what they see as undeniable results now.
It really is a snapshot of a company that feels it's finally got the proof, the hard evidence it needs to potentially unlock some serious growth. Especially, like they said, given how use of force policies and dynamics are changing around the world. All right, that wraps up our deep dive into REP's Q1 2025 earnings call transcript. We've hit the financials, the strategic shifts management talked about, those international plans, and how they're weaving in this new data and the W1 acquisition.
Yeah, it was a really interesting look at how getting that crucial real-world data, even when it's hard to get, like in use of force, can totally reshape a company's story, strategy, and how big it thinks its opportunity is, especially in a complex market like public safety tech.
So what does this all mean? Here's something provocative for you to chew on, kind of stemming from those challenges they mentioned in just getting reliable use of force data nationally. In markets where that independent big picture data is really scarce, how much influence could tech companies selling into that space, like the one we just discussed, actually have on policy and public perception? simply by being the ones who can collect and quantify outcomes, even if it's just for their own products? Does the data they gather end up becoming the sort of de facto benchmark for what success or failure even looks like in that area? Something to think about. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We hope this breakdown gave you a clear and useful picture of the key messages from this particular earnings call.